Before Lindsay Lohan became a cautionary headline, she was Hollywood's favorite red-haired miracle. She had the face audiences remembered instantly, the timing directors trusted, and the kind of early screen charisma that made adults speak about her like she was destined for something enormous. By the mid-2000s, she wasn't just a successful young actress. She was the girl magazines chased, studios wanted, and teenagers copied. On the surface, it looked like the perfect star story. A child actress who made the jump, a teen icon who seemed born for the spotlight, a rising celebrity who had everything the machine knows how to reward. But that is exactly what makes Lindsay Lohan's story so disturbing in retrospect. Because the brighter the image became, the less anyone seemed willing to ask what it was costing her to stay inside it. Then the story changed, and it changed publicly. The cameras that once framed her as charming started framing her as unstable. Paparazzi photos became a daily language. Nightlife, missed sets, court appearances, mugshots, rehab. Suddenly, the same girl Hollywood once treated like a golden child was being consumed like a spectacle. And that's the most brutal contradiction at the center of her story. Lindsay did not disappear from public view when she began to fall apart. She became even more visible. The collapse was not hidden. It was photographed, circulated, mocked, and monetized in real time. That is why her story still hits so hard. It was not just about one actress making mistakes. It was about an entire culture watching a young woman unravel and turning that unraveling into entertainment. So this is where the story begins. Not with a comeback, not with redemption, but with the question that haunts everything that follows. How does a girl the industry helped build become a girl the industry seems unable to protect? How does someone go from child star promise to public cautionary tale while the cameras keep clicking the whole time? Because Lindsay Lohan is not just a celebrity biography. She is one of the clearest examples of what happens when fame arrives too early, hits too hard, and never looks away. Long before the mugshots, the tabloid covers, and the paparazzi frenzy, Lindsay Lohan was the kind of child star Hollywood instantly recognizes as valuable. She had that rare mix the industry loves most. She looked memorable, she felt emotionally readable on camera, and she could carry attention without seeming like she was trying too hard to hold it. For audiences, she did not feel manufactured. She felt bright. That matters because child stars survive not only on talent, but on the illusion that their charm is effortless. Lindsay had that illusion very early. She moved through commercials and modeling work as a little girl, then stepped into acting with the kind of natural confidence that made the transition look almost inevitable. It was not just that she was cute or marketable. It was that people could already see the timing, the spark, and the instinct that would later make her such a magnetic screen presence. Then came The Parent Trap, and everything changed. That film did more than introduce Lindsay Lohan to a wider audience. It announced her as a true movie star in the making. Carrying a role is difficult for any actor. Carrying two versions of the same role as a child and making both feel alive, distinct, and lovable is something else entirely. The film made adults pay attention and made younger audiences attach to her immediately. Hollywood loves a success story it can package cleanly, and Lindsay suddenly fit that story perfectly. The talented young actress with a fresh face, fast instincts, and the kind of all-American appeal that studios knew how to sell. From there, the machine began moving quickly. The more she succeeded, the more obvious it became that she was not just passing through childhood fame. She was being positioned for something bigger. But this is where the story starts to darken beneath the surface. Child stardom always looks magical from the outside because the outside only sees applause, magazine covers, and the fantasy of early success. What it does not see is the pressure of growing up while your personality becomes a product. Lindsay was still a child while the industry was already teaching her a dangerous lesson, that attention equals value, that being wanted is a kind of identity, and that the camera never really stops needing something from you once it learns you can deliver. That is why this stage matters so much. It is the foundation of everything that comes later. Before Lindsay Lohan became a public collapse, she was a public promise. And Hollywood is often most dangerous with the people it first decides to love. By the early 2000s, Lindsay Lohan was no longer simply a former child star with promise. She had become the face of a very specific kind of Hollywood fantasy, the teenage girl who could carry a film, dominate a magazine cover, and still feel like the center of youth culture at the exact same time. Freaky Friday gave her a new level of visibility, but Mean Girls turned that visibility into cultural permanence. That film didn't just make Lindsay famous, it made her part of the language. Suddenly, she wasn't only starring in the kind of movies teenagers watched, she was starring in the kind of movie teenagers quoted, rewatched, and built identity around. She had beauty, comic timing, vulnerability, and the kind of screen confidence that made her seem older than her age, without losing the softness that made audiences root for her. She wasn't just in the spotlight, she was the spotlight. This was the phase when everything around Lindsay started to move faster. Fashion magazines wanted her, studios trusted her, paparazzi followed her. The image being sold was clear. She was Hollywood's newest it girl, the red-haired star who looked glamorous enough to lead a teen movie and messy enough to feel exciting outside of one. That combination made her irresistible to the culture of the time. It also made her extremely vulnerable. Because once a young actress becomes valuable, not only for her work, but for the fantasy of who she is off-screen, the line between career and consumption starts disappearing. Lindsay was no longer just being cast in movies. She was being watched as a lifestyle, an attitude, a public spectacle in progress. The machine around her was no longer asking only whether she could act. It was asking how much of her could be packaged, photographed, and sold before she was old enough to fully understand the cost. And that is why this stage of her life matters so much before the fall begins. On the surface, this is the glamorous chapter, the one full of premieres, hit movies, flashbulbs, and the kind of fame most people are taught to envy. But underneath that glamour, the structure was already unstable. The attention was too constant, the access was too easy. The culture around celebrity at the time was too hungry for excess, and Lindsay was becoming one of its most consumable faces. She looked like she was winning because she was everywhere. But being everywhere is not the same as being safe. By the time Lindsay Lohan became the princess of teen Hollywood, the system had already started building the conditions that would later help destroy her. The fall did not begin with one single disaster. It began with a change in the way the world looked at Lindsay Lohan. For years, the camera had treated her like a star in motion. Bright, desirable, exciting, the girl everyone wanted more of. Then, slowly, that attention changed shape. The same paparazzi who once sold glamour now sold instability. A late-night photo became evidence. A tired face became a headline. A missed appearance became a narrative. The culture around celebrity in the mid-2000s was ruthless, and Lindsay had become one of its favorite subjects. She was no longer being followed because she was thriving. She was being followed because people had started sensing that something was slipping, and in that era, a slipping young woman was profitable. The pressure around her intensified from every direction at once. There were reports of being late, rumors of unpredictable behavior, nightlife stories that followed her from clubs to blogs to tabloid covers by morning. Hollywood has always been forgiving toward chaos when it still looks glamorous, but once chaos starts affecting work, the mood changes fast. Lindsay was no longer just an actress with a messy public image. She was starting to look, in the eyes of the industry, like someone becoming difficult to rely on, and that shift is brutal because it changes the meaning of every image. A party photo is no longer fun, it becomes proof. A candid moment is no longer harmless, it becomes the sign something is wrong. Little by little, the camera stopped romanticizing her and began documenting her like a slow-moving accident. That is what makes this period so important. The collapse that would later look explosive was already being built here, day by day, frame by frame. Lindsay Lohan was still famous, still desired, still impossible to ignore. But the emotional contract between her and the public had changed. People were no longer watching to be dazzled. They were watching to see whether she would hold together. And once a celebrity enters that stage, every private weakness becomes public material. Before the arrests, before the mugshots, before the courtrooms and rehab headlines fully took over, Lindsay was already living inside a new kind of spotlight, one that no longer celebrated her, but waited for her to crack. Then came the version of Lindsay Lohan the world could no longer pretend not to see. In 2007, the story stopped being about rumors, late nights, or tabloid speculation and turned into something harsher, more permanent, and impossible to reframe as glamorous. There were arrests, DUI charges, cocaine possession allegations, rehab stays, and court appearances that transformed her from a troubled young star into one of the most photographed public downfalls of the decade. What made it so brutal was not only the speed, but the repetition. It was not one bad night. It was one headline after another, one image after another, until Lindsay's face no longer represented teen stardom or Hollywood promise. It represented a collapse the world was consuming in real time. The mugshots changed everything. Mugshots are not just records, they are symbols. They freeze a person at their worst and turn that moment into something endlessly shareable, endlessly replayable, endlessly detached from context. Lindsay's mugshots became cultural artifacts, which is a disturbing thing to say about a young woman clearly spiraling. The legal trouble deepened, the rehab stays multiplied, the public scrutiny intensified, and the line between concern and entertainment nearly vanished. That was the ugliest part of her fall. People were not only watching it happen, they were being fed a new version of it every day. Each court date generated new photos. Each release from rehab became another cycle of, "Will she be okay this time?" followed by another story suggesting she wasn't. The industry that once sold her as a fantasy had now repackaged her as a warning. And yet the tragedy of Lindsay Lohan's public ruin was never just addiction or legal trouble on their own. It was the fact that her breakdown happened in an era when celebrity culture had become openly predatory. Paparazzi did not back off because she was in pain. They moved closer. Tabloids did not soften because she was unwell. They sharpened. The same machinery that once built her into a star now kept profiting from each sign that she was losing control. By the early 2010s, jail time, probation violations, rehab, community service, and courtroom headlines had become so tied to her image that the public started forgetting the actress beneath the wreckage. That is what makes this chapter so devastating. Lindsay Lohan did not simply make mistakes in public. She became trapped inside a system that turned every mistake into a marketable event. And once that happened, it became almost impossible for anyone to see her clearly anymore. Not as a talented actress, not as a former child star, but as a human being trying and failing to get back up while the whole world kept filming. For a long time, Lindsay Lohan looked like someone the public had already decided to remember in the past tense. Not dead, not gone, but sealed inside a narrative people no longer expected to change. That is what makes her later return so strange and so powerful. It did not arrive like a loud reinvention campaign or a perfectly engineered redemption arc. It arrived more quietly, almost cautiously, as if both Lindsay and the public were testing whether a different version of her life was still possible. After years of chaos, courtrooms, rehab, and headlines built on collapse, the most shocking thing was not scandal anymore. It was stability. That stability changed the way people looked at her. She began appearing less like a tabloid symbol and more like a person reclaiming control over her own image. The older footage of paparazzi frenzy and public ruin did not disappear, but it no longer felt like the whole story. Lindsay's life began to move in a different rhythm, slower, more private, less addicted to the machinery that had once fed on her. Her later work, public appearances, and interviews carried something her earlier fame never really allowed her to have: distance. And distance matters. It gives a person the chance to exist outside the version of themselves the world has already consumed. In Lindsay's case, it allowed people to remember something that had been buried for years beneath scandal. She was talented long before she was troubled. But the comeback is not meaningful simply because she returned to screens. It matters because she survived the kind of fame that often leaves permanent damage. Lindsay Lohan became famous in one of the most merciless celebrity eras of the modern media age, when a young woman's pain could be packaged as daily entertainment and sold back to the public as gossip. She did not come out of that untouched. No one could. But she came out of it alive, older, clearer, and still standing. And maybe that is the true ending of her story. Not that she became perfect, not that she erased the past, but that she lived long enough to become more than the collapse people once thought would define her forever. That is why Lindsay Lohan's story still matters. Not because it is glamorous, not because it is tragic, but because it reveals something ugly and true about fame itself. Sometimes the world does not destroy a star all at once. It watches the damage happen slowly, then pretends to be surprised by the wreckage. Lindsay survived that, and survival, in a story like hers, is its own kind of miracle.